So, up until now, this series, Why Would Anyone Do That, has examined how mentality of exclusion can express itself through territory access, opportunity, and competition. And now I want to look at employee retention. Employee attrition is not simply a staffing inconvenience, it's a financial event. An employee becomes an investment long before they become profitable. There's the recruiting, hiring, onboarding, paid training, equipment, benefits, administrative processing, and don't forget manager oversight. By the time an employee is fully contributing to the organization has already invested a significant amount of time and money. The more specialized the position, obviously the larger the investment. And that's why the Great Resignation was so disruptive. That was the time marked during and after COVID. The mass departure of employees was not simply a job or labor shortage. It was a hole in a boat. Imagine a boat that is taking in water. And the problem isn't that the hole is small. The problem is what happens if the hole continues to grow. Organizations weren't simply losing headcount. They were losing institutional memory, relationships, customer familiarity, internal system knowledge, leadership pipelines, and predictability. And while it's not commonly discussed, institutions' most valuable asset is its human resource, not the department, human beings. And the concern was not only about replacing labor, it was about preserving stability. And when stability feels threatened, we already know that people will naturally begin to look for ways to restore it and control it. And that does not automatically mean malice. It simply is a recognition that systems often seek to preserve themselves. And I talked earlier in the last video about the embargo, about Pharaoh. Here's another scripture. Exodus chapter 1, verse 10. And it says, "Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply." Pharaoh's concern was not just about who entered his system, if you will. His concern was about what might happen if the Israelites grew, strengthened, organized, or decided to eventually leave. And this speaks directly to institutional self-preservation, fear of movement, and control. And it's often presented as strategy. When leadership has no clear vision for people, and that is no future movement for them, they begin to manage around fear, around movement. They want to control instead of allowing people to grow. And people don't always leave a company because of disloyalty. Sometimes they leave because the organization has already stopped giving them a future. There's no growth potential. Employee retention without vision of growth is simply containment. But here's the important distinction. Containment, while it can appear as retaliation, carries legal risk. Direct punishment for leaving or movement outside of the containment strategy can create evidence. Force or coercion will attract attention. So indirect pressure is a much easier way to defend and preserve. And that's where narrative control becomes very valuable. Excuse me. If leaving cannot be punished directly, then it can be made expensive indirectly. And we know that wealth is not always in the form of monetary value. And when I refer to expense, I'm not necessarily referring to monetary value. And not necessarily through formal process, but through perception. A departed employee may all of a sudden become unreliable, disloyal, uncommitted, ungrateful. They were a risk. And the message never has to be announced. It only has to circulate. People who remain inside the organization are watching. They're learning. Not from a written policy, but from observation. And this is where retention begins to look different. Retention is no longer only about incentives. It's about containment. The goal is to stop the bleed without appearing to stop the bleed. The institution does not need to announce force. The institution begins to look at employees like inventory. And it only needs to shape perception so that staying feels safe and leaving feels like stepping out in the rain. So the organization becomes an umbrella. And that's the loyalty test. Not a question out loud, a pressure system that quietly teaches employees what departure may cost them. And this is also where access control can become useful. Employees who appear likely to leave may notice subtle changes: fewer invitations, less visibility, reduced access to important projects, delayed communication, fewer opportunities to lead. And the changes are rarely dramatic. They're often explainable, plausible deniability. And yet, the practical effect is quite noticeable. The employee becomes less central, less influential, less needed, more replaceable. And their exit begins to look like a personal choice, even when the environment is gradually what pushed them out due to lack of support. Now, once the resignation occurs, another process can begin: reputation management. The organization may not need to attack the departed employee, it only needs to shape the meaning of their departure. A voluntary resignation can quietly become a story about their attitude, their commitment, their fit, their reliability. Their work itself may have been solid, the performance may have been strong, but the story still changes anyway. And this form of pressure is effective because it rarely requires outright false statements. I mean, there's no one to corroborate the story. It's subjective. It's selective framing, selective omission. Those things can travel further than formal documentation. And over time, the narrative becomes the memory. And this is where I think the least discussed form of workplace interference begins to appear: administrative friction. Not direct sabotage, not dramatic confrontation, simply the accumulation of small obstacles, increased scrutiny, additional procedures, institutional bureaucracy, and collectively they consume time, energy, and opportunity. Narrative control and administrative friction often work synergistically. One shapes perception, and the other shapes experience. The employee begins carrying a burden that cannot easily be documented, but can certainly be felt. And this is why I think plausible deniability becomes so effective here. Each event can stand on its own: a missed opportunity, a delayed meeting, cooled relationships, forgotten invitation, neutral reference, stalled conversation. Nothing appears extraordinary, but together they create an entirely different environment, and the result is subtle. And then the employee begins to ask a different question. And it's not, should I leave, but what will happen if I do? And that's a different psychology. That's a different place in the mind. It moves beyond career planning, and it moves into risk management. And that may be one of the most overlooked effects of the post-resignation workplace. The cost of leaving is not always financial. Sometimes it's social, professional, reputational, psychological. People watch what happens to those who leave, and organizations know it. So if a departing employee appears diminished, isolated, or quietly discredited, the observation itself becomes the lesson. Not announcement, but the message travels on its own. Stay. Don't take the risk. And the institution becomes the umbrella from the rain, the safest place. And whether that message is intentionally created or simply emerges from organizational behavior, the effect is still the same. The story becomes more important than the departure. And the deeper question is why departure appears to carry an unspoken penalty. And it's pretty simple and maybe uncomfortable. It's because institutions invest in people, and whether we like it or not, you do have a number on your name, and you are inventory to an entity. And institutions seek stability. Institutions seek to protect themselves. And when direct control becomes difficult, indirect control becomes viable. Narrative control, access control, administrative friction, reputation management, quiet signaling. And the playbook is similar, isn't it? And the objective is simple: stop the bleed. But that raises another question. What happens when an employee is not leaving for another employer? What happens when they are leaving the system itself? What happens when they no longer seek another job, but independence, entrepreneurship, consulting, family business, self-employment, further education? Because that changes the equation entirely. Because a competitor can be matched, a salary can be matched, title can be matched, but freedom cannot. And that's why this conversation moves into another examination of the institution. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for coming. I'm JoAnna.